Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the release of Opportunity and the Complexity, Recommendations for Equitable Climate Resilience in East Boston. My name is Rebecca Hurst. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the director of the Sustainable Solutions Lab, or SISL, at UMass Boston. SISL is a research and action institute focused on ensuring that historically excluded people and communities are safe and healthy in the face of the climate crisis. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that I'm in Boston on the traditional homelands of the Massachusetts people. When we have conversations about climate change, it is essential that we recognize the long, painful history of extraction and colonialism that brought us to this moment. We are so excited to be releasing this research today, and we hope that it will be a helpful addition to the broader conversation about just climate adaptation and true resilience. Professor Antonio Raciti will frame the conversation. Patricio Belloy, SISL Fellow and PhD student in the McCormack Graduate School and lead author of this paper, will present the findings, and Fabian Torres Ardilla will reflect on the report from his perspective as acting director of the Gaston Institute. We will finish with some time for questions, and this conversation is being recorded, and we will share the recording with attendees once it has been uploaded. So let's go ahead and get started. Antonio, take it away.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Good morning, everyone. Thank you again for being here today. I want to spend a few words introducing this research led by Patricio Belloy in East Boston and contextualizing this work within the broader discussion on climate adaptation and planning for resilience. While the report and its findings focus on East Boston, it is also essential to reflect on the implications of this work for the entire city and region, which are currently very much invested in planning a more resilient Metro Boston. This research provides relevant evidence around three major themes that we need to consider when discussing planning for adaptation. The first theme is about preparing the built environment to be protected by the effects of climate change. The second one is about reflecting critically on the ongoing adaptation planning efforts, focusing specifically on coastal green infrastructures and the impacts that these have on coastal communities. Finally, the third one focuses on what approach to planning is desirable for these coastal communities to move forward. In this light, this research identifies recommendations on how to plan and to build a more just city and region in the face of the climate crisis. Before I let Patricio present the report, I would like to say a few words on each of those themes. First, it is essential to reflect on what climate adaptation agenda we're fostering in Metro Boston. I recently co-led a UMass SISL team's research project showing that we currently tend to favor a climate adaptation agenda, predominantly favoring public investment for physical infrastructure to the detriment of social preparedness to climate change. This points to the need to reflect on the meaning of socially just resilience. This report highlights the urgency of rethinking how to integrate the social dimension of preparedness in the planning approaches focused on physical resilience. The second point that I want to make is related to the risk of keep looking at greening the city to be prepared for climate change. In the last decade, national and international research has been assessing the impacts of green infrastructure projects to achieve a more resilient urban environment. Unfortunately, the overall picture does not look very good. To make this operation economically feasible, we're seeing that the greening of our coast often parallels the rapid gentrification of the neighborhoods and communities living along those coasts. Green infrastructures might be a good technical solutions, but are alone insufficient. This report points to the need to reimagine technical interventions, such as green infrastructures, by questioning who gains and who loses from these projects, and how we can better put technical planning and design skills to service communities' ideas and needs. Finally, this research suggests rethinking how we plan our cities for climate change and identifies co-production approaches as a viable ways to reimagine adaptation planning. Co-production approaches to climate adaptation planning move beyond just including inputs from too often silenced communities during consultation moments. Instead, these approaches consider representatives of these communities as an integral part of the decision-making process. Ultimately, the adoption of co-production approaches to plan for a more just city and region in the face of climate change calls for innovation on the current legal and planning system to allow communities to be an integral part of this process. So without further ado, I would invite Patricio to share his findings.
Thank you, Antonio. So, hello, everybody. My name is Patricio Belloy. I am, my pronouns are he, him, and I am a PhD student in public policy at the McCormack Graduate School, UMass Boston. I'm also a research assistant at the Sustainable Solutions Lab. I apologize in advance. My throat is a bit sore, and we just had a great presentation in Spanish of the same project. So now it's the turn for the English one. The title of this report is Opportunity in the Complexity, Recommendations for Equitable Climate Resilience in East Boston. And we conducted this research with Professor Antonio Raciti, Katsyris Rivera-Kientz, who cannot be here today with us, and Rebecca Hurst, but also with the support of everyone here at the Sustainable Solutions Lab and several people from East Boston that helped us make sense, right, of what we saw during this research. The summary of this presentation is first, we're going to go through a background, right, for those who are not that familiar with the situation in East Boston. Then we're going to talk about this research project and the opportunity of it. We're going to convey a framework, a theoretical framework we used, and later at the end, we will share some findings and recommendations coming from the same residents and ourselves in our interpretations. So, East Boston is this neighborhood you can see there in the photo. It's a diverse working class coastal neighborhood situated in a peninsula across the Boston Harbor. It is home to over 47,000 residents from different cultures and backgrounds. Today, Hispanic or Latinos make up more than half of East Boston residents. It is also a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. While we can debate about the goods and bads of gentrification, what is true is that the CDC links gentrification with worsening living conditions and a number of health problems. There are also some relevant problems related to pollution from the airport, multidimensional poverty, and lack of access to services for those with irregular migratory status. You can see the airport there at the right side of the photo. In the last years, the face of the neighborhood has changed as a number of high-end residential buildings are located now across the neighborhood's waterfront. In addition to housing pressures and the pollution from Logan Airport, among other problems, technical and scientific assessments warn that a large part of the neighborhood is at risk of being severely affected by climate change impacts, especially like sea level rise and storm surges. According to Climate Ready Boston, East Boston has the most land area of all Boston neighborhoods exposed to coastal storms in the coming decades, with exposure concentrated near the East Boston Greenway, that you can see there at the center of that image, Maverick Square, and the Sumner and Callahan tunnels that connect East Boston to the Boston downtown and other areas. Nearly 50% of East Boston land area will be exposed to coastal flooding at the 1% annual chance event as soon as 2070. Some of those water entry points we can see here experienced significant flooding during the winter of 2018, when the simultaneous occurrence of an astronomical high tide, storm surge, and sea level rise caused water levels that flooded streets in several low-lying areas of the neighborhood. The city plan to address the situation, not only in East Boston, but in the whole city of Boston, is called Climate Ready Boston. Climate Ready Boston produced a vision for East Boston that considers coastal protection with co-benefits such as open areas, waterfront plazas, floating green and gray interventions, and docks that would improve connectivity. Residents in general like this vision, but at the same time are concerned that this may not be implementable due to limitations set by private ownership, existing regulations, funding possibilities, and associated trade-offs to carry the project forward. We're going to focus now on this area to your left, right on Central Square and the waterfront plaza that it's in the vision of Climate Ready Boston. Zooming in to this Central Square area, we can see the difference between the current landscape and the vision from Climate Ready Boston. The strip mall to your right is privately owned, and the use of the area facing the water lays within the designated port area, or DPA, of East Boston, which we will use as a segue to talk about this project. We can see also that, yeah, it's quite different so far today, the vision and what we can see today. The designated port area policy was established in 1978 to promote and protect water-dependent industrial uses and commercial activities relying on marine transportation. There are 10 DPAs in the state and 4 in the greater Boston area. Those are Mystic River, Chelsea Creek, South Boston, and East Boston. In early 2020, the Boston Planning and Development Authority, the BPDA, asked the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management, the CZM, to consider the removal of certain portions of the East Boston DPA. We can see here some of the planning units considered right by the CZM in blue. There's approximately roughly 4 of them. Those are also composed by different parcels and portions, but those are the ones that are in place today. Although the BPDA suggested flood vulnerability as one of the factors to justify this action, in addition to the lack of active water-dependent industrial activity, residents have expressed concern about a potential freeway to build more high-end housing in case the portions or the areas under review are finally designated. At the end of my presentation, we will have some updates about how is this request from the BPDA to the CZM going. So that is the origin of this project. The CZM review of the DPA in East Boston provides a new opportunity to go beyond mainstream climate resilience strategies and implement new ones that are more equitable, increasingly participatory, and address historical injustices. A group of organizations called the Boston Waterfront Partners contacted the University of Massachusetts Boston Sustainable Solutions Lab to assist them with answering the question, what should an equitable climate resilience strategy for East Boston include? To address that question, we conducted 17 semi-structured interviews with community organizers, representatives also of the private sector, and residents of the neighborhood. In addition to reviewing official planning documents, academic literature, and reports, and we also participated in online community meetings organized by the BPDA within a new mixed-use development that was Suffolk Downs. As a framework, we use the conditions for just adaptation suggested by Malloy and Ashcraft in 2020. Of course, they based their work on the work of more authors who have written about just adaptation or environmental justice and climate justice in the last years. In a nutshell, they suggest, among other things in their work, 3 conditions for just adaptation. First, demand the inclusion of socially marginalized populations as full participants with agency to shape the decisions that affect them. Second, require that participation framings explicitly recognize the causes of systemic injustice. And third, require a focus on incremental evaluations of implementation to avoid timeframes which are inconsistent with advancing justice. So, regarding the first condition, and demand the inclusion of socially marginalized populations as full participants with agency to shape the decisions that affect them, we can share with you that most respondents shared a historic dissatisfaction with planning processes and interaction with developers, despite recent improvements in outreach and community engagement that they do acknowledge. As a result, some residents question the role of the BPDA and other public agencies in leading community engagement processes. Some neighbors denounce a complex relationship also with Massport, the port authority that operates the Logan Airport and also owns some land in the waterfront. In the opinion of a longtime East Boston resident, for example, the relationship that Massport has with the state is wrong. As they are private when they want to be private, they are public when they want to get with their way. Community meetings, community activists also mentioned, right, that they are starting to see some responsibility of Massport with the accelerated high-end development, residential development on the waterfront, which is also affecting the relationship between the authority and the communities, but also the planning agencies, right, that have a relationship that is kind of close, according to their views, with Massport. Community activists also recognize two limitations that impede the most marginalized communities from actively participating in consultations. The first is some degree of division between communities in the neighborhood because of cultural division, because of funding, you know. And the second is our resource constraints, particularly for small grassroots organizations. It is fair to say also that some of these organizations receive a big part of their funding sometimes from companies or from Massport. So there's there's a dilemma there. According to some community organizers, also they also stress the point of having really community organizers doing the work of community engagement. They mention in this quote that they, the agencies, need community organizers, not just community meetings. They are not trained in community outreach, not trained in equity, not trained in racial or language justice. There's more details about this in the report that we'll make available to you. Regarding the second condition for just adaptation, they require that adaptation framings explicitly recognize the causes of systemic injustice. The most pressing socioeconomic problems seems to be connected to housing and long-term affordability. It is threatening the preservation of the neighborhood's diverse community, according to interviewees. Waterfront development has not brought, according to many, economic prosperity to long-time residents. Some even question the idea that more development is helping to increase the stock of affordable housing. And according to others, new areas that have been developed were designed for newcomers and have created amenities that do not encourage them to leave their buildings and integrate into the community. The importance of housing stability that, according to this interview, is being affected by the boom by East Boston being considered the hotspot for new high-end residents, is expressed in this quote from an East Boston community representative, saying that once a person or a family is stabilized in housing, which is difficult to achieve today, that person, that is usually the beginning of them being able to move out of poverty. They say that housing competes with food in a horrible vicious cycle. And once you have a place to stay, you can focus on having your paperwork done or getting some jobs or owning your own business. So they are seeing home ownership further from their possibilities and also for their next generations. In this same second condition, problem to access quality education and good jobs are also among the most pressing problems reported by interviewees. Only 16% of East Boston students enroll in higher education, the lowest proportion in Boston. The main barrier seems to be affordability, the high cost of tuition, and the opportunity cost attached to pursuing higher education of people who needs to decide between going to college or work to help their families do better. When talking about employment opportunities, residents feel that throughout the worst part of the pandemic, who knows if it's over or not, the city kept operating thanks to workers like those from East Boston. Data shows that 87% of East Boston residents who are employed work in low-paid jobs like protective services, food preparation, building cleaning, and other service occupation, which is by far the largest proportion among neighborhoods in the city. These types of jobs are among the most likely to be disrupted by climate disasters and the least likely to be able to do remotely during a climate emergency like a huge storm. This challenge was clearly seen and is still being seen with the COVID-19 pandemic. Other economically active population work at local companies, shops, and restaurants, which are known for preferentially hiring local residents. Business owners state that the most pressing problems they face are excessive vehicle traffic, uninviting walkable space, little demand from new residents, and lack of access to the waterfront. Small businesses are also extremely vulnerable to climate disaster and often are unable to reopen after a severe climate-related event. In terms of economic opportunities, probably the most affected of all are undocumented immigrants and their families. They regularly work in informal, low-paid jobs and are not eligible for unemployment benefits. Latinx residents, on their side, report not feeling welcome in trades that provide well-paid unionized jobs, so those opportunities are rarely incentivized to youngsters. There are more details about what we could capture on this second condition for just adaptation to address systemic injustice in the report. The third condition for just adaptation is to require a focus on incremental evaluation of implementation to avoid timeframes that are inconsistent with advancing justice. For that, we would like to show this quote from the East Boston Master Plan in 2000. I will read. East Boston's neighborhoods are stable, with a high rate of ownership despite changing demographics. Residential areas have continued to increase in value in line with current economic prosperity. Thus, land uses within residential neighborhoods have undergone little change. The future of East Boston neighborhoods should not be devastated by major land use changes for new development, but upon the minor land use changes to protect the existing quality of life. For those who know East Boston and what has happened in the last couple of decades, we leave up to you to judge, right, or contrast this statement 20 years ago with what we see today in the neighborhood. That basically highlights how important is incremental evaluation and for communities to feel empowered to denounce those changes, to notice those changes, and to discuss about what is happening to their neighborhood before it's too late. So we try to understand what are issues that residents would like to see addressed by adaptation strategies, particularly in relation to these three conditions for just adaptation: demand more inclusion, address systemic injustice, and more incremental evaluations of policies and plans. These are the recommendations we have based on residents' perspectives and our own interpretation of the data we collected. The first recommendation is that when reviewing the de-designation of areas of the waterfront, we need to prioritize the vision of East Boston residents have for access to the waterfront for community members and small businesses, particularly in the DPA parcel near the Central Square areas, but also along all the waterfront. A second recommendation is that has to do more with participation in this case, and direct participation, and it's about officials explaining complex ideas that will impact communities. Those ideas ideally should be that explanation should be bilingual and communities should be able to engage in discussions in their native language, the language of the majority of the audience. We heard problems with translators, right? That complex ideas in English are transferred very simple in Spanish. And then when someone whose native language is Spanish and would like to convey a complex idea, a translator can do a really good job, but might be simplifying as well that idea. And then the discussion happens at different levels. People is aware of that. And this is a step that other cities have taken, meaning someone in the planning department or among the developing company or any other agency should be bilingual, should speak a language of the community and be accountable to them for what is happening. Another recommendation is to improve the relationship with the community in the case of Massport. Massport should address the claims about their business model and political influence through a transparent community process, hopefully with the assistance of independent facilitation. For this, planning agencies and organized community groups should encourage the use of neutral professional mediators to help manage community engagement, build trust, and support the generation of a common vision for equitable resilience, equitable climate resilience, so that planning agencies are not in the double role of regulator and facilitator in the same way that Massport will not be in the same role of funding organizations and also be a facilitator later. In addition to the idea of mutual mediation, a complementary proposal mentioned by a group of interviewees is that agencies should hire community organizers from East Boston and pay them for their time, instead of deploying their own staff to do community engagement. Finally, establishing a permanent committee that includes residents, perhaps with the support of a university or other partner institution in charge of monitoring multidimensional indicators that can shed light on changing trends and better diagnose the state of community resilience in the neighborhood. All of these recommendations are more elaborated, of course, in the report. The report is available, as we mentioned, in English and Spanish. And just a final reflection from my side, I have reflected about this case and previous work I did on consensus building between hydroelectricity companies and indigenous communities in the south of Chile. And I see some striking similarities. If we put ourselves in the shoes of someone who lives, long-time resident of East Boston, might be the case that you got there to the neighborhood because you had no choice, because you were displaced either from your country of origin or from other areas of the city. When there, while trying to work and to thrive and to help your family, advance, suddenly a resource that it is there in the community becomes valuable, a resource that probably before was not that valuable, being it a mineral, a river with a technically viable slope, like in the case I was doing my research, or a nice waterfront looking at the skyline of Boston. Then your participation in the future use of that resource and in the future of your community becomes limited many times. So for me, the case of East Boston resembles a bit the case of an extractive industry that is taking something of value or using something of value for the community and sometimes not allowing the amount of participation that they deserve. Thank you so much. And you can place your questions, of course, in the Q&A box. And now I'm going to let Rebecca say some words, especially about the updates on the CZM and the DPA in East Boston. Thank you so much.
I think actually Fabian is going to go next, and then I'll come after Fabian.
Okay. So.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Patricio. And thank you everyone who is present. My name is Fabian Torres Antila. I am the Associate Director of the Mauricio Gaston Institute at UMass Boston. Just for you to know, the Gaston Institute has been here for more than 30 years, focused on documenting the issues affecting the Latino communities in Massachusetts. It feels always weird to me to talk to my screen and not knowing how you are reacting. So please feel free to write any question or clarifying question in the Q&A or the chat. So definitely I would like to start by thanking CISO for the invitation and also congratulating the entire research team for the excellent work, and thanking in particular Patricio for his presentation, but also for allowing me to give a few remarks in relation to the reading of my own reading of the report and how it connects with the work that we do at the Gaston. So as you can imagine, my reading of this report cannot be really separated from the fact that East Boston is a Latino majority ethnic enclave. In fact, East Boston grew in the last decade from census 2010 to 2020 was really determined by Latino growth. About 53% of all the growth in East Boston was produced by Latino growth. As such, Latino enclave East Boston somehow reproduces dynamics that are similar to others in similar Latino enclaves across the state. And so I would like to focus on these brief remarks on how the results from this report somehow reflect similar views on all the Latinos in the state. Of course, there is a caveat, because as you know, Massachusetts Latinos are not a homogeneous group. 50% of all Latinos in the state are Puerto Rican, about 25% are Dominican, and the remaining 25% is distributed across all Latin America origins, but there is definitely representation of about 8 different nationalities. 3 of them are Salvadorian, Honduran, Colombian, Brazilians. So it's a very non-homogeneous community. There is no quintessential Latino. And so at the regional level, this appears a different historical context for the different communities. It's not the same to talk about the Dominican community in Lawrence as the Puerto Rican community in Springfield or the Brazilian community in Marlborough or Framingham. Even here in the city of Boston, the Latino community of East Boston has a different historical context and background from the context of the Latino community in the South End, for example, Villa Victoria, which are only separated 2 miles. So with that caveat, that talking about Latinos, we're talking about all this diversity, the thing that I found interesting in this report is that there are common elements that I have seen in other works done in the Gaston in different places that kind of tell a little bit about the relations that exist between the Latino community, local governments, mainly when decisions are made that affect the community. And so those common elements are, one of them is the community participation mechanism. The other one has to do with the recognition or not of the cultural wealth and assets that are brought by the Latino community by the Latinos to the community. And the third one is the issue of representation, political representation in local and state political bodies. So with respect to the first one, community participation mechanism, one thing that I noticed appears in the report, but I noticed as well in other things that we have done here in the Gaston, is that majority of cases, Latino community does not see this participatory process to be inclusive. In fact, they seem to say over and over that the existing mechanisms are not appropriate for full participation of the community. Starting with the acknowledging that Latinos do speak Spanish, and passing through the fact that information that is conveyed sometimes is not conveyed in ways that is understandable. But also that it also includes that most of the time when decisions are made, they don't consider the resident vision for the community. And in fact, or sometimes only represent a segment of the community. In fact, residents don't feel represented by the decision maker. They are not part of the group of the bodies that make the decision. And they are not even sure whether the participatory process, whatever they say, is actually included or incorporated in the final decision. The second aspect, the second commonality is that the recognition, or sometimes not the recognition of the cultural wealth and assets that are brought by the Latino community to the city. And as you know, and Patricio was mentioning this, for many Latinos, being in the city in East Boston was not a question of choice. Different factors lead them there, but they make, out of that, they create opportunities, economic opportunities, employment opportunities. They create what I call ethnic economies that are really based on employing members of the community, selling to members of the community, and any changes and decisions made that don't consider this will affect them deeply. Patricia was mentioning the fact that the new residents in the East Boston are not customers of the old businesses. So this affects us really. And the decisions are made without taking into account this thing. And of course, the last thing that I wanted to refer to is that I see prominent in the report is this idea that we don't see representation in local and state political bodies. And that's part of one of the issues that Latino communities had in the state. We represent 12% of the population in the state, according to the latest census. In some places, we represent, beginning in Lawrence, for example, it's about 80%. In Chelsea, it's about 60%. In the city of Boston, it's about 20%. So we are no majority in many cities. And in the places in which we are majority, the political representation is actually not proportional to the share of the population. So this kind of creates, first, a lack of somehow uncoordinated or weak institutional presence that somehow is representing Latino interests. And that's something that the community says over and over. And also that says that decisions are made without transparency. Whoever makes the decision is because there is the impression there are some political alliances between economical powers and whatnot that don't take into account Latino interests. So I wanted to go back then to Villa Victoria, which is in the south end, because I think Villa Victoria gives an example or a path that the community in East Boston can follow. And if you remember, Villa Victoria was born the Puerto Rican community, the South End, who organized and basically took control of the way they were going to develop themselves. They won a battle against the development agency at that time, and they create a model of affordable housing that responded to the needs of the community. It's a model that everybody uses about what kind of community activists can really achieve. Right now, the actual forum, you probably know about this, is Inquilinos Boricuas en Acción. And so they are still there, and they can be actually an extraordinary resource to help organizers and political activists and activists in the city of in East Boston to understand what can we do, what is within the realm of organization, the things that they can do to organize themselves. I think that Villa Victoria and Eva show that it is possible to resist tremendous market power, but it goes through and needs the coalition building, and learning how to build coalitions is something that it could be an important aspect in this, in order to address the needs of East Boston. I want to finish then highlighting some of the positives that I found in this report. And one of the things that struck me the most is first, that existing organizations and existing activists, the commitment that they have to East Boston, the clarity they manifest in understanding the problem. It seems that they understand more the problem than even the entities who are making the decisions. And I think they also show some capacity to think about the possible futures that are more equitable and respond to the needs of the community. And of course, this talks to the fact that still the need for continued organization of the different actors, and the fact that some more stronger alliances need to be created. Thank you again for being here, and thank you, Cecil, for inviting me.
Thanks so much, Fabian. And thank you, Antonio and Patricio, as well. And thank you all for joining us. I did want to just share a brief update, which is that on Wednesday, CZM released their decision that each of the evaluating the different planning units in East Boston and looking at which ones were eligible for de-designation. And they found that there were only 2 that were eligible for de-designation, and they ended up only de-designating 1 of them. So some of the areas that that were most of most interest in the conversations that Patricio had with folks and in the conversations surrounding this report are going to remain as designated port areas for the next 5 years. And this is great news, and really, as Antonio mentioned earlier, provides an opportunity for longer term thinking and planning and organizing of community members to think about what exactly do people want to see and how can that happen in East Boston. So I will put the link for that in the chat as well, of the boundary review report if you're interested in looking at that. And now we will open it up for questions and answers.
And also, thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you everyone who collaborated with this research. I also, something that I put in the chat is a new book that was just released some weeks ago, where it's called The Green City and Social Injustice, 2021 Tales from North America and Europe. And there's a chapter in East Boston that has very similar views to what this research was about. It's by Shokri and Angelovsky. I'm sorry if I mispronounced their last names, but it's I suggest that reading for those who are interested, as someone asked in the Q&A about the relationship between green amenities, right? Green resilience infrastructure and gentrification. We have a question here, says, thanks for this wonderful presentation. Could you speak about how these great recommendations could be translated into implementations? Well, that's the challenge in the next 5 years. I think we now have a window of opportunity. We now have, you know, the next review of the DPS can be in 5 years. So I think it is the moment to start thinking more than in influencing or mainstreaming, you know, that's something we should also do. The practices of the official authorities, what Antonio generally stresses, which is plural planning. You see, planning that emerges from the communities, planning that in partnership with other communities, with professionals, with universities, with people who is willing, right, to help the residents imagine a different neighborhood or maintain their neighborhood as they like it, right? Can get together and offer and say, you know, this is robust enough for us to have a full seat at the table. We have thought on an alternative. So I think it is a great opportunity. I'm not sure if Antonio, you want to mention something more about it?
Yeah, I mean, everything you said is totally on point. What I want to stress out here is that similar research, the research that you led, Patricio, I think is crucial to define a normative horizon of work. And so you identify several different recommendations. We do not have the magic wand and like say, okay, we're gonna do this way. The thing is, you can red flag certain things that are happening and identify suggestions on how to move forward. In order to move forward, we need to think about how each of those recommendations can be actually implemented. That means finding resources, changing established systems, creating new partnerships, and so on. So this is like a stepping stone. This research is a stepping stone to the next chapter. And it's important to focus on each one of those recommendations to find out what kind of resources we need to find to move this conversation forward. The other thing is a couple of those recommendations are kind of low-hanging fruits. Fabian and Patricio both mentioned an issue about culture. I think when we talk about planning, we need to think about what kind of skills and tools we have to get closer to the community there ultimately is the community that is the main recipient of these plans. And from this research, it really appears that many of the planning skills that have been used are not really appropriate. Translators, cultural mediators are fundamental to do good planning. And those are things that you can actually implement tomorrow. So I'm just trying to kind of picture different levels of recommendations, like short-term, medium-term, and long-term. And for each one of those, we need to look around and see what kind of resources we have.
Yes, thank you. And I would like to stress also the point of, for many, it is not, usual. People are not used to external neutral mediation facilitation. In my previous work, the first time we got and talked to companies about it, they would say, no, why? We've never done that. We can do our own outreach and we know how to do it, but that's not your business. Actually, your business is building, your business is other. And there is people who today are more trained and capable of really integrating the views of different stakeholders into results. So yeah, it is something that sometimes we have a bit afraid of, but there's institution in Boston, for example, in the Boston area, with decades of experience doing this. So it'll be good to listen to them too. We have a couple of questions from John Walkie. First, the BPDA has emphasized the concept of private developers implementing resiliency in their projects on their own dime, thereby obviating the need for limited public funds going into these solutions. Looking at recent East Boston waterfront development or other locations in Boston, can you speak to how well that has worked? Well, of course, there's people here, probably in the audience and here, that knows way more than I do. I can talk about what it's being said, I guess, in economics, in academic circles. And well, Boston is becoming an example of, in literature about an area that has decided that resilience, especially in waterfront areas, are a private responsibility, or that ideally we can give that responsibility to private developers. The results of that is an ongoing conversation. The book that I mentioned there in the chat talks about these issues, right? And although when you do the trade-off, right, between not using limited public funding, I suppose, right, for doing this, but allowing private funding to do this, there's going to be consequences. And who puts the money plays the music, and many times also directs the way you dance, and any other things where it means the party is yours. And I guess we need to be more sincere, more honest about that. What does it imply, right? That we are doing this with private money. And if we can agree, actually, that private money is a contribution, and that still the community will have a full seat at the moment of making decisions about the future of those areas, perfect. But that conversation we need to have it. I'm not sure if anyone else would like to say anything from the panel here.
Yeah, maybe I would like to add something to what you just said, Patricio, and actually thinking about the question, like how well that has worked. And I think what we have beginning saying is that working has to work for the community as well. So it may have worked for some, or may have not worked for some others. I think that what we have been stressing in these recommendations is that if neither public funds or private funds guarantee full participation of the community, then we can basically guess that community won't be represented in the final product, and it's not going to respond to the needs of the community. That's really what these recommendations are about. If we want, it was something that works for the community, we had to ensure that the community is represented somehow with true and genuine participation mechanism, which I think is what these recommendations are all about. we cannot deny that the money, the city doesn't have the money, and we cannot deny that just trying to create a resilient Boston, just the technical solutions that we're talking about, the greening solutions, that's going to be very expensive. And we all have to pay. But if we decide we don't want to pay, then we're going to decide if someone else pays, what is what we are paying back? So what is our cost? What is the cost to us decided not to pay for something? It's this decision that the public institutions have to do. If we don't want to pay for this, allowing you to pay, what is the cost for me? And these are the things that are not being into account when making the decision.
Thank you so much, Fabian. There's another question said, what will be the consequence of not following the recommendations? Who will suffer and enjoy such consequences? Well, clearly those recommendations, thank you so much for your question, but these recommendations are not exhaustive, meaning there's a lot of things more we heard from our interviewees. People, residents and organizations, some of them are present probably on the audience, have been working on this for a long time. They really know what works and what not, and they have their own recommendations in their websites every time they present. So we really don't think, right, that this is in no way setting something different from what you hear from them. So there's a lot of different perspectives. You can see this problem that sometimes can help us think about solutions and make these recommendations easier maybe to implement. In my case, I am doing my dissertation work and I will use a needs-based framework. So I would like to see how the intersection between climate resiliency policies and the ongoing gentrification process works in terms of fundamental human needs of the community. Will that be translated as it is into policy? I'm not sure, but it will give a different perspective of the problem and how the people is affected in their identity, in their subsistence, in their affection, in their freedoms, and so on. Things that probably, I hope my conclusions will still make this, create more information that can be added to a future, hopefully plural plan. We have another question. Does this report or others from your team make recommendations for other state agencies' actions to make climate resilience initiatives more equitable? Well, there's, we mentioned some of the agencies in the report. Maybe Rebecca also, because of past research of Sustainable Solutions Lab, they have already assisted local governments on how to see this from the perspective of funding, of governance. And I'm not sure, Rebecca, if you have any view on this question.
Well, I think fundamentally finding ways to deeply listen and have a much broader and more democratic process so that people are able to, so that everybody's able to determine or have more of a say in decision making is really essential and is one of the themes that comes across in all of our research. And in this report, some of the specific things that are identified around language access, being able to fully participate, thinking about incremental evaluation, and also just understanding the broader systems and how everything is interconnected with each other, so that we're not trying to fix one thing and inadvertently make another thing worse, are all key pieces that come up again and again.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I'm going to read the last question because of time. I think this will be the last one. Thank you so much. If the climate disaster turns out to be on the worst side, East Boston will face seriously grave situations. As we work hard to preserve the community, isn't there an additional challenge of increasing the economic prowess of all community members so that they can deal with such disasters? That is exactly the kind of lens we use for this. That's why we integrated a whole section, right, on historic intersectional injustice. Is because we think we need to go from climate resiliency or waterfront resiliency to community resilience. It is important, right, that all those resources of education, of having a good job, of being able to save, having, housing stability, having a good community you can trust on, you can rely on, more organization, local businesses, endogenous economic growth, meaning that the money is also flowing within East Boston, and so the power to come back after a shock like climate disaster is also there, and you don't depend on the outside. Those are things we would like to emphasize, and that's it. That is what is community resilience. There is a lot of literature on community resilience even from before the climate change became a scientific political issue. And I think we need to learn from those initiatives like Fabian mentioned, right? And in Boston, that happened several decades ago, but the problem overall, it's not that different, meaning we have a different source of a shock, and we have an opportunity, especially in this very complex scenario in this new reality we are living, right, to do the things in a different way and to really go again from climate resilience to community resilience. So
that's a great place to end on. Sorry, Fabian, did you want to say something else?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something, that we try to think on is Boston because it's on the other side of the harbor as is Boston problem, but in reality, this is a problem for all of us living in Boston, all of us living in the greater Boston area. And like your question, Karen, is interesting about, because it's true, there is a challenge of increasing the economic conditions of the Latino community and the community that is in East Boston. And definitely it requires like a much more wider approach. But the fact that they are not able to deal with that is going to affect all of us, because all of us are the ones who had to pay for the disasters that are going to happen right there, beginning with traffic and then out with transportation, and leading with a group of climate refugees. That where are they going to live? They had to go somewhere. So that's really the challenge for the city, because it's not just East Boston right there. It's all of us. All of us have a stake in East Boston.
So thank you so much, everyone who participated in this research. Thank you so much for the support of Sustainable Solutions Lab and the Dean's Office of the McCormack Graduate School, UMass Boston in general, and everyone who participated, everyone who talked to us, and the Boston Waterfront partners also. You are really, it's great that it's in good hands, the people that is looking at this right from a new perspective. We're happy to keep contributing. That it's what CISL does. We like to be there in this discussion. Thank you so much.